Moss poles can get quite a lot of hate online. A lot of people agree that moss poles suck. But I think people just suck at building them, using them and watering them correctly. So in today's video I'm going to unpack 10 reasons why you might be struggling with moss poles. Hello everybody and welcome back to our YouTube channel. It's not a secret, I absolutely love moss poles. I've been using them for over 5 years, and if it wasn't for moss poles, I don't think my plant hobby would have really ever escalated in the way that it did. If it wasn't for moss poles, I certainly wouldn't have a YouTube channel. So I really enjoy using moss poles and I really enjoy talking about them quite clearly because I really think they make this hobby so much more rewarding and enjoyable. But moss poles get a whole lot of hate online with a lot of people really bashing moss poles and their functionality and complaining about how much work they are and that they're not worth it and so on. And look, at the end of the day, your hobby, you run it the way that you want to run it. As long as you end up enjoying your hobby, we're all winning, right? And I do think that not every plant needs a moss pole. I do think that not every growing environment might be suitable to moss poles, but just looking at the complaints I get in my comments, DMs and via email and all the questions that I get, I do think there's an element of misunderstanding over here because yes, if you use moss poles incorrectly, there can be a whole lot of work, seemingly impossible, and might not even yield the results that you want in the first place. Sometimes small tips and tricks can really make the difference and make a really cumbersome, annoying process suddenly really smooth and easy. And today I want to give you 10 reasons why your moss poles might suck, and I want to give you ways of fixing it so that hopefully by the end of the video you feel encouraged to maybe pick up a moss pole yet again. Before we go into those 10 things, I think it would be really beneficial for me to give you a really quick, and I'm really gonna try and be quick, synopsis of why I like using moss poles in the first place and really what makes them so unique compared to any other support. At the end of the day, a moss pole in itself is not going to make your plant thrive automatically. Whether or not your plant is thriving will always be set by the conditions, so that is light, temperature, humidity and airflow. And if those conditions are as close as possible to the plant's natural environment, your plant is going to thrive no matter what support you grow it on or not. The moss pole is really just part of my care routine. I'm using the moss pole to realize the potential that the conditions have set in the first place. So no, in itself the moss pole isn't going to make your plants thrive. In itself the moss pole isn't going to make your plants mature, but the moss pole is a tool that helps me realize the potential that the conditions have set. Of course, we're only talking about climbing plants over here, clumpy plants or like a plant like an alocasia that grows from a rhizome, or crawling plants won't benefit from a moss pole. So of course we always got to grow the plant in line with its natural growth pattern. But at the end of the day, moss poles are also just one kind of support. You could also just put it on a piece of bark, which would actually be closest to nature, or you could put it on a veggie trellis and so on. But I've got a full video where I compare different types of supports and their pros and cons, and I'll link that down in the description. The advantage of using a moss pole over any other support is that the moss pole isn't just a support mimicking the tree in nature, it is also a vertical extension of the pot. Moss is a growing medium. The plant is going to grow into the moss pole as it climbs up, establishing a root system all throughout the moss pole. And roots are essential for the plant's survival. The more roots, the healthier the roots, the more likely your plant is actually going to realize the potential that the conditions have set. So that is really the main advantage. It's an extension of the pot, and with that comes the benefit of it being an insurance policy. You would need to have root rot throughout the pot as well as the whole pole before you really end up with an unrooted plant. So it's a bit of an insurance policy in case something goes wrong down below. It is a propagation benefit because we're basically air layering the plant with every single node as we grow the plant. So it's already propagated by the time you chop the plant. And trust me, you have to chop the plant eventually because, well, we don't have unlimited ceiling height. So really it enables me to reach maturity with my plants faster because I don't need to induce setbacks every time the plant reaches the top of its support, which any of the other supports wouldn't really have to offer. And lastly, the moss pole also enables me to create a nice display. If we're looking at this Florida Ghost, for example, it has quite long petioles, but because I have it on this D-shaped moss pole and because light is just coming from the front, I am stopping this plant from sending petioles 360 degrees around the pole, which would take up, well, twice as much space, right? So the moss pole kind of forces all the petioles to go this way. So it is also a tool for me to create nice displays on top of it being functional. Now that we really understand what moss poles are all about, it is also quite clear to think that you would want to establish as many roots as possible within that moss pole, because only then you can realize all of these other benefits. Now, not all roots are the same. Specifically with these climbing plants, we really have two types of roots over here. We have anchoring roots, which are roots that the plant uses to anchor itself onto its host. So that is something that a plant would do on a tree, for example. It would just cling onto the tree so that it doesn't fall off. But these roots don't necessarily contribute to water and nutrient absorption. They can, but only to an extent. With the moss pole, because we're keeping it moist, it encourages the plant to grow water roots. So it will grow the same roots that normally are established in the pot, it will grow that into the pole, and then these roots can even branch off and grow secondary roots and so on. So we're establishing a secondary root system vertically stacked throughout the moss pole if we're keeping the media moist. And that, I suppose, is where people start getting angry at moss poles. I think the first 7 points on my list are actually all around people struggling to keep their moss poles moist. That is by far the most common complaint I get about moss poles, and I get it. It is definitely the trickiest aspect of growing on moss poles. You do have the need for more frequent watering, but if you're doing it correctly, that might not mean that it's any more work. But let's start off with the moss pole construction in the first place. And I mainly use two types of moss poles. I use plastic backed moss poles. They're from a company called Grow Vertical, which is linked in the description with a discount code and international shipping. You're a little bit antsy today. By the way, sorry if there's lots of construction noise. The neighbors just do not stop building, like ever. And then these ones are my DIY moss poles that I make myself, and I've got a tutorial on those, and I also have a whole video comparing different types of moss poles, which I will also link in the description down below. 25% of times when I get a message, comment or email from somebody saying that they're struggling to keep their moss pole moist and they happen to attach a photo, they happen to not use a moss pole in the first place. And I'm sometimes guilty of that as well, because I just kind of call everything moss pole, even if sometimes the moss pole is not filled with moss. For example, my Florida Beauty that I showed you earlier is actually on a grow pole filled with aeroid mix. I still call them moss pole just out of habit. So I think overall in the market, people refer to moss poles as moss poles without the moss pole even being filled with moss. I see coco coir poles being sold as moss poles, or people using coco coir moss poles and then asking me what's wrong with their moss pole. The moss part is wrong with your moss pole. I use sustainably harvested New Zealand sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss is the growing media with the best water retention. Compared to the poles with aeroid mix, for example, the sphagnum moss has a much higher water retention. And if we're comparing that to coco coir has basically no water retention compared to moss. So yes, if you're trying to keep a coco coir pole moist, you are setting yourself an impossible task. So first things first, you got to make sure that you actually use a media in the pole that has good water retention. It doesn't need to be sphagnum moss. I also used cocoa chunks before, for example, or as I showed you earlier, the aeroid mix, or tree fern fiber, for example. But from my experience, sphagnum moss is the cleanest and has the best water retention. So that is definitely my preference. Now also keep in mind that maybe not all sphagnum moss might have the same amount of water retention capacity, and as the moss gets older, the water retention capacity also reduces. But I've also had moss poles that are older than 3 years and the moss was still perfectly fine. So I don't think that that in itself is really the issue. I think people getting cocoquia and sphagnum moss confused is really the issue over here. So make sure that you're filling your moss pole with a growing medium that can absorb water in the first place, or else you're really gonna struggle with the watering, in the end. The second issue why you might be struggling with your moss pole is that you're not filling it with enough moss. I just went on about how moss is the part that retains moisture, so obviously you also want to make sure that you fill your moss pole with sufficient moss. If you just flake a few strands of moss into your pole, of course there isn't much moss to retain much water, which means that it's going to evaporate and or be used by the plant much quicker. So the more moss you can stuff in your pole, the more water retention you'll have. However, you can also overstuff your moss pole. You don't want it to be so dense that the roots, for example, can't penetrate anymore. So I would always say kind of on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is just flaking it in and 10 is compressing it as hard as you can, I would say it's like a 6 or 7 out of 10. Quite easy to tell with this moss pole over here, for example. It's the Grow Vertical pole, and I fill it with moss until the mesh at the front bulges out, right? Then I know that there's enough moss in there. If that mesh would cave in, I know that there is not enough moss in there to really retain the moisture. Plus, moss is ultimately the growing media, right? So if you don't have enough growing media, what exactly are the roots going to grow into? The third reason, and we're still on the construction of the moss pole, is that it might just not be thick enough. I make mine with a 16 centimeter diameter. That to me is kind of a good balance. If I make it thicker, the moss pole obviously is going to get heavier and also going to use more resources, which makes it more expensive. If I make it skinnier, then it again can't hold that much moss. Specifically, the ratio of the surface area to the center of the moss pole is just not that good if you go with a really skinny moss pole. The surface is what dries out first because that touches the air, most likely the air is dry. So you want to reduce the surface area while having enough moss in the center that is not exposed to the surface. So a cylinder is a good idea, but if your cylinder gets too small, then basically all of the moss is the surface. There isn't really a nice center in the moss pole that can actually retain moisture in the first place. Obviously the thickness of the pole also depends on the plant or how many plants I'm going to put on there, but I've been making these 6 centimeter poles for over 5 years now, and they work for like 90% of my collection. Only like a really few select plants or plants that are triple, quadruple planted, that are like 5 years, that have like 5 years of growth on them and are quite mature. Only they really started needing larger moss poles. I don't even have one surrounded. I mean, look at this Escalodor over here. It's quite large and still on just this moss pole over here. The next reason why you might be struggling with moss poles is the moss pole being too short. Now, it kind of seems intuitive to maybe just go with a moss pole that is the appropriate height of your plant at the time of potting up the plant, but I disagree. I always give my plants a 90 centimeter moss pole from the beginning because, well, those are just the moss poles that I make. Then it's easy. I make them in bulk, they're all 90 centimeters, and eventually they'll be stacked on top of each other to a maximum of 180 centimeters. So really easy. All of my moss poles fit on top of each other, right? They're all the same. Now, the reason why I do that is that, first of all, it is less effort for me, right? Instead of having, eventually, the goal is for the plant to grow up that 180 centimeter moss pole, and then I do a chop and extend. Chop and extend is where I chop the plant in half, pot up the top half, and re-extend it. So the more extension pieces I have, the more work I have to do, right? So if my 180 centimeter moss pole is made out of 2 segments, I just need to do 1 extension. If it's made out of 4 segments, then I would have to do 3 extensions, basically tripling the effort. And I suppose we're trying to reduce the effort that moss poles make, right? But the other reason comes back to water retention. Gravity makes water drain down, so the shorter your moss pole, the less water retention it has, because it has less moss, it retains less water. If I would water these 2 moss poles right now, for example, this one is half the height, so if this one could, let's say, absorb 1 liter of water, This one could only absorb half a liter of water. Well, guess what? Half a liter is going to evaporate faster than 1 liter. Water is going to drain down, so the top of the moss pole is going to dry out first, while the bottom of the moss pole is going to stay moist for the longest. If your plant is attached down here, the moss pole is going to dry out over the course of a week, and the bottom part is still staying moist. Whereas this one will probably dry out over the course of 2 days before the dry part starts where the plant is, right? And at the end of the day, you don't want the moss pole to dry out because you don't want the root system to die. We just established the root system in there. We want to keep it, we want to nourish it, we want to feed it. What are you doing? So while giving it a tall moss pole straight away might seem counterintuitive at the beginning, it actually significantly reduces the watering requirement. I water my plants that reach the top of the moss pole almost twice as often as plants that are still at the bottom of the moss pole, for exactly that reason. The next reason why you might be struggling with your moss pole is because you're not plastic backing them. I just mentioned the surface area of the moss pole and so on. Well, if we can cover half of the moss pole with plastic that ensures that no water is going to evaporate, then you are going to significantly reduce the water that evaporates. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be a half moon shape. You can also just put a little bit of plastic on the round moss pole or even inside of the round moss pole. I've also seen people cling wrap their moss poles, which obviously aesthetically is very, very interesting, but it works, I suppose. The idea here is that if you expose less moss to the air, then less water can evaporate and you will increase the water retention of your moss pole. So if you're struggling with moss poles drying out too quickly, definitely recommend plastic backed moss poles. The only disadvantage of these is that you now only have one side to grow on, which I use most of the time anyway. Most of my plants only grow on one side, so they don't take up all too much space. The next reason is that you might just be putting the moss pole in an environment that is way too dry. I grow tropical aeroids on these moss poles, so I'm aiming for all of these aeroids to be grown in around about 60% humidity, which is somewhat easy to achieve in Sydney. We do have to heat the house quite a lot over 3 months of the year, and then for about 6 months of the year we really have to air condition the house heavily. So there are elements that make them dry out. I even use moss poles outside as well, and they obviously dry out much faster due to the high airflow and sometimes 40-degree hot days and so on. But at the end of the day, I know that if I put the moss pole in an environment that is nice and humid, it's going to dry out less quickly because, well, the air isn't so dry, sucking all the moisture out of the moss pole. But at the same time, the moss pole and the water evaporating from the moss pole also gives the environment a bit of a humidity boost. So by now I have so many moss poles that they create their own little humid environment that stops them from drying out as much. If you're trying to grow a tropical plant on a moss pole in a 20% humidity environment, it will be an uphill battle for sure, and it's probably something that you should consider. Are you willing to put in that effort? I'm not saying that moss pole is always the solution. If I would be living in an environment that's 20% humidity, I would be very, very picky with which plant gets a moss pole and which plant doesn't. Only the ones that I really want to see mature would get one. And I would group them together and try and somehow create a more humid environment where they are, right? But then to be honest, I don't think you're going to have much success growing the plants in 20% humidity in the first place. Maybe growing tropical aeroids in itself is not a good idea if you have about 20% humidity. So obviously moss poles are not really a recommendation there. But yeah, basically, if you can produce a humid environment for these moss poles to be in, then obviously less water is going to evaporate. I need to water my moss poles in the IKEA cabinet, for example, like hardly ever, because it's like 99% humidity in there and it just doesn't really dry out, ever. There's of course the plant that is opposite of the heater that gets hot air blasted at it all day. I need to water a little more frequently, right? The environment definitely matters, but going back to the previous point, well, you can shelter half of the moss pole from the environment. So if you're in a dry environment, definitely plastic back it, but it still might not be enough to really compensate for the super dry conditions. Alrighty, so that was kind of all about the construction of the moss pole and putting it in the right spot in the first place. But then on an ongoing basis, you obviously need to keep this moss pile moist. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. If you use the right technique in watering, then it's actually a walk in the park. And I was inspired by Past Plant Life on Instagram, who actually she was the first person I've ever seen do that, but we now call it the water bottle upside down technique. We've got a bottle over here. There's a few holes in the lid of that moss pile. I just drilled them in there, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, doesn't really matter. At the top of my moss pile over here, I have a little cavity that can fit my bottleneck. Alrighty, let me make this a bit bigger. Sorry, this moss pile has never been watered before. And I flip it upside down. And now over here, the goal is for the water to slowly be released. You see the little bubbles? Now for that release of water to work, I need 2 things. I need to break the surface tension of the water, so these holes need to make a little bit of contact with the moss, but not enough contact with the moss for them to be fully blocked. So I sometimes wiggle it around, and then based on the wiggling, I can increase the speed of water or I can decrease it, right? So just play around. There's no right or wrong. It doesn't really matter if this, let me stop this because I don't actually need to water this empty pile. The speed of release is kind of irrelevant. Sometimes it takes 5 minutes, sometimes it takes an hour to slowly release. At the end of the day, I always do this water bottle upside down technique before the moss pile is fully dry. So I take the moss pile. This one's actually quite dry, so I'll do that after this video. Hear that? Quite crunchy. At the bottom, however, not crunchy yet. So I walk around my house and I crunch all of my moss piles, and then based on the crunch, I know if I need to flip a bottle upside down or not. Based on how crunchy the sound is, I know how much water should be in that water bottle as well. There is no rule, because it really depends on how much moss is in your moss pile, how thick your moss pile is, how tall your moss pile is, how big the plant on the moss pile is, how dry the moss pile is. Like a really dry, thick moss pile could obviously take way more water than a skinny pile that hasn't fully dried out yet. So the volume of water in itself is kind of like an understanding that I developed over the last 5 years. Through trial and error. I water the plant, I check the pot afterwards to see if there's any excess water, and if there is excess water, then, well, I use too much volume of water. It wasn't the wrong thing to water today because the moss pile was crunchy, I just used too much volume. The goal is for the water to moisten the moss pile, maybe have a little bit of excess water go into the pot as well, but not drown the whole thing. So with that technique, it is actually super easy. I mean, you saw that flipping the bottle upside down on a pole takes about 5 seconds. It's actually more work to fill up the bottle than it is to water with the bottle. And then from there, it's automated and gravity does all of it by itself. So while I might have to water my moss pots more frequently, each watering activity is actually very easy. And it is something I do just in the morning. I walk around with my coffee. Where's my coffee, by the way? Here. And it gives me an opportunity to also check on my plants, see if there might be signs of pests and so on. So it's just a part of my overall well-being check, but also just, walking around, seeing new growth, enjoying my plants. I do not perceive it as work. The only time it becomes a little bit annoying is if I go away for a few days, because it does require consistency and somewhat high frequency in watering. The frequency, however, again depends on how dry the moss pile is. So I assess it always with my crunch technique, but of course, if it's a really cold, humid week, the piles aren't going to dry out as quickly as if it's a really hot, dry week, for example. So at all times, you got to assess the watering need in the first place. There is no fixed schedule. I have a full watering tutorial as well, where I explain it in a little bit more detail in case that was a little too rushed for you. But the goal here is to water the moss pile from the inside out with a decent amount of volume. I might be putting a whole liter of water down this moss pile for a big plant like that. Obviously, if I give a liter of water, that also means that a liter of water is available for the plant to absorb and to evaporate. If I would walk around with just a spray gun and I just spray the surface of the moss pile, very unlikely for me to spray a liter of water onto that surface. So I might only be using 100 milliliters on the surface. In that moment, it looks like, yes, the moss pile is moist, but well, there's only now 100 milliliters for the water to absorb and for it to evaporate. So, it will realistically evaporate 10 times as fast because there's only 1/10 of the water. Plus, you're really just spraying the surface of the moss pole. The surface is what dries out first. You're not even getting to the center of the moss pole and keeping that moist, the part that can actually retain the moisture quite nicely. So I very, very, very rarely go around and spray my moss poles because it's messy, it's a whole lot of work, and it's just extremely inefficient and time consuming. So I reckon having the right watering technique is such a small thing that can make all the difference and actually turn it into something fun. I have to say, because of the squeeze technique, I feel most comfortable watering my moss poles. I feel like there's absolutely no guessing work involved, because I have much better access at assessing the watering needs of the moss pole. With a pot, yes, you can, if it's see-through, you can kind of look for condensation, you look for color, you can look for weight and so on. But I feel like when watering a plant in a pot, there's always way more guessing involved than with a plant on a moss pole. It's super easy. You crunch it, it's crunchy, go water. So I find watering moss poles much safer as well. It's really just the consistency and the high frequency. But I also have weeks where I don't water my moss poles at all. It's definitely nothing that I do on a daily basis. When people say, I get so many comments in DMs from people saying like, my moss pole dries out every day. Like every day. I reckon if your moss pole dries out every day, out of those 7 things that I mentioned so far, you're probably at least hitting 3 or 4 of them. It might be way too skinny, not filled enough, you're watering incorrectly, and you probably have it right in front of a heater or something like that. I'm not too sure. Wow, I get so passionate about this one. Okay, so that was really the construction, the positioning, and the watering of the moss pole. Now, the problem with the water bottle upside down technique is that it requires your moss pole to have a higher level of stability. And that's really the second lot of feedback that I get. People are struggling in keeping their moss poles upright. I think there's 3 reasons as to why that might be. The 8th reason why you struggle with moss poles is probably because you're not using the right material. I do not recommend using a plastic mesh. The plastic mesh will most likely not have enough structural integrity. I use a coated wire mesh in a cylinder form that has that should have good stability. These moss poles should really be able to stand up by themselves. I don't want the moss pole to cave in by itself or be floppy or whatever. There should be enough structural integrity for you to do these sort of things with the moss pole without it bending and so on, right? So I think that's the first thing. Construct it so it's structurally sound in the first place. If your moss pole is already dodgy before you even start putting a plant on it, or before you water it, keep in mind when it's watered it's going to be much heavier, then we're going to be in trouble. So first things first, use a coated wire or galvanized wire. Make sure it doesn't rust. Next, the reason why your moss pole might be unstable is because you're not potting it all the way to the bottom of the pot. I attached the plant to the pole over here, and I recently actually did a video on that, which I'll probably also link in the description. And then I fill this bottom part that I leave empty right now with aeroid mix, which will be the substrate of the pot, and then I put it all the way to the bottom of the pot. If that's the case, the pot and the pole and everything starts becoming one unit. If you're worried, you can also cable tie it. I usually also put it towards the back end of the pot so that it has more stability. Now, when I top it up with aeroid mix, this is going to become one unit. The moss pole in itself is stable, and because I planted it to the bottom of the pot, the likeliness of my pole falling out of my pot is very unlikely. If I just stuff this in later, then the chances of the pole falling out of the pot are much, much higher. So pot it all the way to the bottom, don't just stick it in there in hindsight. And then lastly, this whole thing can obviously still fall over, right? So that's the last element of stability that we now need to fix. And to fix that, you can obviously give it a larger pot so it has a larger area to stand on. But that also takes up more space. What I really do, I have all of my pots in decorative planters. These are heavy. Ideally you have a really snug fit, and now this pole can't fall anymore because the planter is making it bottom heavy. With the planter you now also have the ability to, for example, tilt it slightly backwards if the plant is facing forward and dragging the plant forward. Plus, the planter obviously also catches excess water in case you're still working on the volume learning curve. And it provides shade to the root system where you use see-through pots and roots prefer shade. And of course, on top of that, it looks good. Ideally, you have a really nice snug fit, so I always use 14 and 20 centimeter pots for my moss pots. Only a few are in like 25 centimeter pots. Because I always use the same size of nursery pots, I just have a really large collection of pots that I've accumulated over the years that all have a really good fit. There isn't one specific place that I go to buy all of my pots. Majority would be from Bunnings, but it is really just something that I've collected over the last 6 years. Right? From here, there, whenever I see a good pot, I'll buy it. And those are really 10 things that you can do to increase your success with moss piles. But I do acknowledge that you might work on these 10 things and it's still not your cup of tea. That is also perfectly fine. I'm definitely not forcing anybody to use moss piles, you know. Hopefully nobody's forcing you to do anything in your hobby that you don't want to do. But maybe some of these 10 items really help somebody who wants to grow on moss piles, is just very hesitant to do so because of all of the negativity that sometimes surround moss piles. At the end of the day, there is a direct correlation between the effort that you put in your moss piles and the reward that you get out of them. I know a lot of people like to grow their plants based on neglect, or they like to thrive on neglect plants. If you're that kind of plant parent, moss piles is definitely not your thing. Moss piles are definitely a tool for people that want to optimize the growth. They want to see their plants thrive as quickly as possible. They want to have the least setbacks when it comes to propagation. They want to have the least risk involved in air layering and propagating and so on. And the effort that you put into constructing and maintaining these moss piles will be rewarded, of course, only if you have the right conditions in the first place. So for me, the effort to reward ratio with these moss piles is just worth it. I like growing big plants. That is what makes me happy. I don't think I would be as passionate about this hobby if I wouldn't be as successful in growing nice looking plants and continuously growing nice looking plants. So I'm more than willing to put in the work, but I understand that not everybody is in that position. Not everybody also does this as a full-time job, but I also have had many moss piles while having a full-time job. So I know what it's like to do both as well. At the end of the day, I'm just offering solution in case you want to take them. If you don't want to take them, then don't. As you might have noticed by this video, I'm very passionate about my moss piles. And I suppose that is the main thing that I do on this YouTube channel as well. So I have so many videos on moss piles, how to make them, how to water them, how to extend them, how to chop them, how to upgrade them, how to extend them horizontally, how to stitch them together. Everything you could think of, moss alternatives, everything. I don't think there's anything that I've ever not said. Everything that I've learned about moss piles and this journey over the last 5 years has been recorded in videos, and I put all of these videos in a moss pile playlist, which will be linked at the end screen. So if you want to learn more about moss piles, please check those out in the comments down below. Let's learn from each other. Whereabouts in the world are you? Do you have success with moss piles? Is there something that you do differently to me that helped you be successful with the conditions and the environment that you got to work with, and so on? Which one out of those 10 was a game changer for you? Let's turn the comment section into a bit of a community help area. I like the sound of that. But also make sure you give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and turn on the bell icon so you get a notification every time I post, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video.